My sister chose her absent, deadbeat biological father to walk her down the aisle instead of the man who actually raised her. In the end, none of them showed up to the wedding. I don't even know how to start talking about the complete mess that was my half-sister Nicole's 27F wedding this past weekend. For context, I'm 16, and Nicole and I are kind of close, but there's a big age gap between us. Let me backtrack so all of this makes sense. My mom, Karen, 51F, was married to this deadbeat named Gary for about 5 years. He's Nicole's dad. They split up when she was just 3 years old. He was kind of in and out of her life until she turned 7, and then he just vanished. Around the same time, my mom started dating my dad, Mike, 58M, and they got married when Nicole was 7. I showed up about 4 years later. I've always admired Nicole, even though we're not super tight. She was always kind to me, but with the 11-year gap, we never really hung out much, and my parents didn't make her babysit me. She went off to college when I was 7, so while we're close-ish, I feel like we could have been closer if we weren't so far apart in age. I don't even know how to start talking about the complete mess that was my half-sister Nicole's 27F wedding this past weekend. For context, I'm 16, and Nicole and I are kind of close, but there's a big age gap between us. Let me backtrack so all of this makes sense. My mom, Karen, 51F, was married to this deadbeat named Gary for about 5 years. He's Nicole's dad. They split up when she was just 3 years old. He was kind of in and out of her life until she turned 7, and then he just vanished. Around the same time, my mom started dating my dad, Mike, 58M, and they got married when Nicole was 7. I showed up about 4 years later. I've always admired Nicole, even though we're not super tight. She was always kind to me, but with the 11-year gap, we never really hung out much, and my parents didn't make her babysit me. She went off to college when I was 7, so while we're close-ish, I feel like we could have been closer if we weren't so far apart in age. So, all of this is based on what my mom has told me about Gary. She said when they were dating in college, Gary seemed like a great guy. They got married in a big wedding during their senior year, which Gary's dad paid for. My mom says that even though Gary liked to party and smoke weed back then, he worked really hard in school. My mom was pretty into the party scene too, so it all just kind of worked. But things took a turn after they graduated. Turns out, the only reason Gary worked so hard in college was that it was a requirement for him to get his inheritance. Gary's dad is loaded. He didn't get the money right away, though. Gary's dad made it clear that if Gary and his brothers had a degree and a family, they'd get their trust funds when they hit 30 or 40 or something like that. So Gary had the degree and was married to my mom. But after college, he didn't even try to find a real job. My mom got a good one right away, but Gary just drifted between jobs, living off my mom's income while smoking pot all day, and was fixated on having a kid. A year into their marriage, my mom got pregnant with Nicole, and that's when Gary completely checked out. My mom got a promotion around the same time, which was lucky because Gary couldn't be trusted alone with Nicole, so she had to pay for daycare even though Gary was home all day. It seemed like he'd hit his life goal and was just biding his time until he could cash in on his dad's deal. My mom tried to push him to do something, but he never budged, so she finally had enough and divorced him. Over the next few years, he was a terrible dad, missing scheduled visits, dropping Nicole off early, having no food in the house, and constantly asking my mom for money. She usually gave it to him because she didn't want Nicole to go without. When Nicole was 7, my mom married my dad, Mike. From what I've seen, Nicole and my dad have always had a good relationship. My mom let Mike be the fun parent with her, not so much with me, but that's another story. Still, there were a few times when he had to step up and be the bad guy. He coached her sports teams, took her dress shopping, and was generally involved in her life. Nicole even started calling him Dad, and for most of her life, that's who he was. In the 18 years Gary was gone, he only sent her 2 birthday cards, one when she was 8, probably the first year after he left, and another one when she was 14, which arrived almost 2 months late. So, for Nicole, my dad was her only real dad. But then, 2 years ago, Gary popped back up. Gary was around for about 6 months, trying to reconnect with Nicole, and for whatever reason, she let him back in. But just as quickly, he ghosted her again for another 6 months. A year ago, Gary reappeared and actually stuck around this time. He seems clean and sober now. Nicole's been including him in all the wedding plans, which has annoyed my parents since Gary has been nothing but opinionated without contributing financially. My parents have footed the bill for everything. To make things worse, Nicole started calling my dad stepdad when we're around other people, even though she still calls him dad when it's just us. As the wedding got closer, this really started to bother my parents. Nicole wouldn't clarify who she wanted to do things like walk her down the aisle, have the father-daughter dance, or give a speech. She kept saying she'd decide at the rehearsal dinner. My mom kept reminding her of Gary's absence and my dad's presence in her life. But Nicole didn't seem to get the message. Going into the wedding, I knew my parents were going to be mad because it was obvious Nicole was planning to split these big moments between Gary and my dad. We got to the rehearsal dinner on Thursday. Everyone was gathered, and Nicole started going over who would be doing what during the wedding. That's when she dropped the bomb. She wanted Gary to do all the traditional father roles. I saw the hurt on my dad's face and the fury on my mom's, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My mom stood up and said, "Why would you choose him for any of that? He's barely been around." The room went dead silent. After a moment, Nicole said, "We've missed so much time together, and I want to start making memories now. I don't see why you have to make this a thing. It's important to me to have these moments with my real father." Then my mom dropped the real bombshell. "If you want your real father, you should be choosing Mike, because he is your real father." Nicole, now crying, looked confused and said, "What are you talking about?" That's when my dad pulled out some folded-up papers. They were results from a paternity test taken when Nicole was 3 years old. The papers clearly showed that my dad was actually her biological father. Gary grabbed a copy, his face turning red with rage, and shouted, "What the hell is this, you lying bitch?" My mom shot back, "Oh, please. The second we graduated, I knew you were a worthless loser, and you've proven me right time and again. You've been nothing but a fake, wasting years of my life. I've got my reasons for everything that's happened, and I don't owe you any explanations, Gary. You never noticed or figured out a thing anyway. God, I can't stand you. If you had just stayed gone, everything would have been fine. Now you've got no reason to stick around. Go crawl back into whatever gutter you came from and drink yourself into oblivion." At this point, Nicole and her fiancé stormed out, with Nicole in tears. The rest of the guests sat in shock, and Gary was boiling over. He charged at my mom and dad, but it was a terrible move. Gary's about 5'10" with the body of a guy who's been drinking and smoking his whole life, while my dad's a solid 6'3" and built like he spent the last 30 years in the gym. The slap my dad gave Gary was like a thunderclap. It literally knocked him off his feet. And yes, you read that right. It was just a slap. Gary stayed down, stunned and defeated. My dad calmly told him, "Don't try that again, or next time I won't be so nice." After that, my parents came over and asked if I could ride home with my grandparents since they needed some time alone. I told them that was fine. I didn't hear anything else until the next day. Gary disappeared again, and no one has seen him since. My parents called to let me know they wouldn't be at the wedding. They said they had talked to Nicole, and she was a wreck. She'd asked them not to come, and my parents understood. They didn't want to make things worse. The wedding did go on Saturday. I ended up walking Nicole down the aisle, and most of the guests still showed up. The only ones missing were a few of Gary's relatives and my parents. The ceremony itself was nice, but you could see the sadness in Nicole's eyes. She tried to enjoy the day, but it was clear she was struggling. They left for their honeymoon the next day, and I stayed with my grandparents while everything was happening. I got back home today, and my parents said they'd answer any questions I had. I'm not even sure what I want to know at this point. Everything just feels so messed up. I hope I'll get the chance to update everyone once Nicole gets back. I know this isn't the update everyone was hoping for, but Nicole's still away on her honeymoon. I finally mustered up the courage to ask my parents about what happened at the rehearsal dinner. For those who guessed money was involved, you hit the nail on the head. After a year of marriage, with Gary doing nothing, my mom told him she wanted a divorce. Gary knew his dad wouldn't give him anything if he got divorced, at least not right away. He begged my mom to stay until he got his inheritance. Then, they'd split and she'd get half. My mom agreed, but mentally checked out of the marriage. She started going out more, and that's when she met my dad, Mike, and began seeing him behind Gary's back. I asked why all the secrecy if they were both just in it for the money. My mom said it was because if she got caught cheating, Gary could use that as an excuse to divorce her without his dad cutting him off. My mom admitted she messed up and got pregnant by my dad. I asked her if Gary would have figured it out, considering they were just faking the marriage. She said, "This is probably too much info, but once I knew I was pregnant, I had to, do what I had to do to keep up the act." Gross. When Nicole was born, Gary's name went on the birth certificate. My mom stuck it out for 3 years, hoping they'd get the inheritance money, but eventually she'd had enough and divorced him. She didn't give up on the idea entirely, though. Knowing Gary was a total screw-up who'd likely never get his life together, she decided to keep pretending that Nicole was his daughter, hoping Nicole could eventually get the money. My mom said this turned into a long con, which I'm pretty sure she just said to sound cool. I know she picked up that term from watching too much Lost. Luckily, Gary's dad was not the grandparent type. He didn't want to be around Nicole at all. Mom said he was one of those children should be seen, not heard kind of guys. So she kept sending him pictures and letters about all of Nicole's accomplishments, even after Gary disappeared from our lives. It took another 8 years, but she eventually convinced him, who by then had completely given up on Gary, to give Gary's share of the inheritance to Nicole. That amounted to $350,000. By the time Nicole was 15, Gary's dad was still around, and my mom worried about possible legal trouble if the truth came out, so she never told anyone. Gary had been gone for 8 years, and Nicole had developed a strong bond with our dad. She'd been calling him Dad for years by then. Mom admits she was wrong not to tell Nicole, but given everything, she thought things were fine and didn't want to mess that up. Every penny of the money went towards Nicole. It covered her 4.5 years of college, grad school, a new car when she graduated high school, her rent after she moved out of the dorms, and a monthly allowance. The rest was used for her wedding and honeymoon. My parents do well financially, but we're not rich by any means. Gary's dad passed away about 2.5 years ago, and that's when Gary tried to claim his inheritance, only to find out it had already been given to Nicole. That's when he showed up for those 6 months, trying to reconnect with her. After about half a year, he asked my mom about the money, and she told him it was gone. That's when he disappeared again, and my mom hoped it was for good. Since it had been so long, she decided to let the lie stand. She regrets it now, but didn't want to disrupt the family's peace. But Gary came back and hung around all last year. He wouldn't leave, and Nicole kept getting closer to him. My mom kept hoping he'd screw up again and disappear, but it never happened. When Nicole started pushing my dad aside, it really hurt them. They both admitted they made a bad call but felt desperate to get Gary out of the picture. They hoped Nicole would pick my dad for the father roles, and when she didn't, they dropped the truth bomb. They regret how things went down at the wedding and not telling her sooner, but they know they can't change the past. They're committed to making it up to her when she gets back and ask me to keep being a supportive brother. I know this might not be the update everyone was hoping for, but Nicole's still on her honeymoon. It took me a few days, but I finally worked up the courage to ask my parents about what happened at the rehearsal dinner. For those who guessed it was about money, congrats, you got it right. After a year of marriage, and with Gary doing absolutely nothing, my mom told him she wanted a divorce. Gary knew his dad would never give him anything if he got divorced, at least not anytime soon. He begged my mom to stick around until he got the inheritance, then they'd split, and she'd get half. She agreed but mentally checked out of the marriage. That's when she started going out and met my dad, Mike, seeing him behind Gary's back. When I asked why all the secrecy if they were just in it for the money, she said it was because if she got caught cheating, Gary might have grounds to divorce her without angering his dad and losing his inheritance. My mom admitted she messed up when she got pregnant by my dad. I asked her if Gary would have figured out Nicole wasn't his, considering they were faking the whole marriage. She replied, "This is probably too much information, but once I found out I was pregnant, I did what I had to do." Gross, I know. When Nicole was born, Gary's name went on the birth certificate. My mom stuck around for 3 years, hoping to get the inheritance money, but eventually she'd had enough and divorced him. She didn't completely give up, though. She knew Gary was a total mess and likely wouldn't ever get his act together. So, if she could keep up the charade that Nicole was his daughter, there was a chance Nicole could still get the money. My mom said it was a long con, though she only used that term because she picked it up from watching Lost. Thankfully, Gary's dad wasn't involved as a grandparent. He didn't want anything to do with Nicole. Mom said he was the type who thought kids should be seen and not heard. She kept sending him pictures and letters about Nicole's accomplishments, even after Gary disappeared. It took about 8 more years, but she eventually convinced him, who by then had completely given up on his son, to give Gary's inheritance share to Nicole. That ended up being $350,000. Nicole was 15 when this happened, and Gary's dad was still alive. My mom was terrified of legal trouble if the truth ever came out, so she kept quiet. By then, Gary had been out of the picture for 8 years, and Nicole and our dad had really bonded. She'd been calling him Dad for a long time. Mom admits she was wrong not to tell Nicole at some point, but with how things were going, she didn't want to disrupt anything. The entire sum went toward Nicole. It covered her 4.5 years of college, grad school, a brand new car when she graduated high school, her rent when she moved off campus, and a monthly allowance for whatever she wanted. The remaining funds went to her wedding and honeymoon. My parents do well financially, but were far from wealthy. About 2.5 years ago, Gary's dad passed away. Mom knew that Gary tried to claim his inheritance, only to find out it had already gone to Nicole. That was when he resurfaced for 6 months, trying to reconnect with her. Eventually, Gary asked Mom about the money, and she told him it was all spent. That's when he vanished again, and Mom hoped it was the last time they'd hear from him. Since so much time had passed, she decided to let the lie rest, figuring it wasn't worth disrupting everyone's peace. But then Gary came back and wouldn't leave, hanging around for the entire year. Nicole kept growing closer to him, and Mom kept hoping he'd screw up or disappear. But that never happened. When Nicole started pushing my dad aside, it really bothered them. They both admit they made poor choices, but were desperate to get Gary out of the picture. They had hoped Nicole would choose my dad for the fatherly roles at the wedding, and when she didn't, they felt like they had no choice but to reveal everything. They regret how things unfolded at the wedding and not telling Nicole sooner, but they know there's no undoing it now. They're committed to making things right when Nicole gets back and asked me to keep being a supportive brother.